Welcome to another session of lectures by Lob-EZ. I'm your host, Dr. Lob-EZ. Today's topic, Great Depression, stock market crash, an English economist by the name of John Maynard Keynes, and then, of course, hopefully you're all familiar with the New Deal took place here in the United States. Okay, so first thing we're going to talk about is what is the Great Depression? It is the global economic crisis that began in 1929. And depending on which economic historian you ask, did it end in 1939 or later? Okay, some say that it was the war, World War II, the outbreak of World War II that brought the Depression to an end. Why? In large part because of mass conscription, meaning the draft. Many of the unemployed workers were just sort of gobbled up into the draft and serving as soldiers, so therefore no longer unemployed. At any rate, let's talk about the background. Okay, so after World War I, despite the economic struggles, in the previous video we talked about how economic prosperity returned 1924 to 1929, 1925 actually, with the Dawes Plan. Anyway, so after the war, there was sort of this restoration of laissez-faire type of, or liberal, if you will, economic liberalism throughout much of the West. And that means little economic, or at least the expectation was that there would be little governmental interference in the economy. But a little interesting factoid is because of the war, we start to see some very large business cartels. And what that means is monopolies. And in order to protect capitalism, governments have to take a limiting have to take a regulation stance against those, and also the existence of labor unions, because they will grow drastically from 1920s, 1930s into the 1940s, not just in Europe, but also in the United States and Canada as well. All right, so the economic prosperity from 1924 to 1929, a good word to describe that is fragile. Okay. So let's go ahead and quickly dive into the causes. Okay, so during World War I, the Allied nations, the Allied powers, were very dependent upon the United States to be the arsenal for democracy, meaning the United States had to provide not only weapons and supplies, but also food, okay? And so American companies were quite profitable, as were American farmers. And the expectation was that even after the war ended in 1918, that the the profitability of American firms and farmers would continue for a period of time as Europe sort of rebuilt itself. And therefore they were surprised to learn that that wasn't the case, that European countries recovered faster than expected, and farmers as well, meaning there was less demand for American produced manufacturing goods as well as agricultural products. All right, so what that's going to do is, because of the laws of supply and demand, cause the prices to drop. It's interesting to note, it's important to note, that American farmers during the war took out loans. They took out loans to expand production, either by buying more land or by buying new and improved farming equipment. So that put them on the hook with banks, to be able to service those loans on a monthly basis. So it wasn't as if this is anything that they could tolerate very well, these lower prices, because, they had to make payments on a regular basis. So the response, and it was definitely the wrong response, was for the farmers to boost production in an attempt to kind of make up the difference. So let's say prices fell by half. Farmers thought that if they doubled as much as possible their food production or agricultural production, that would sort of cause the gap or whatever to close, which didn't happen because of laws of supply and demand. That increased supply caused the price to agricultural prices to drop even further. And so that creates a lot of struggles for American and I would probably imagine Canadian farmers. A lot of financial troubles. Okay. Now, something else that is going to hurt Americans is the fact that there's a pretty large divide between rich and poor in the United States. And all that means, really, is that we have a lot of working class people in the United States at this time, not a lot of middle class people. I'm going to use a different, or I'm going to kind of use an economic description so you understand what working class versus middle class means. Working class means you have just enough money to make ends meet, with very little money left over for leisure activities or disposable wealth, disposable income that can be used for purchasing consumer items, leisure activities, etc. Middle class means you have plenty of disposable income on hand. So the problem with the United States is that wages hadn't yet gotten to the point where we have a majority of Americans in that middle class sort of bracket, economic bracket. So it was quite difficult for Americans in the working class to purchase a lot of consumer items, and they were very dependent on credit, buying things on credit. Like you're probably not even familiar with something called layaway plans, but essentially what consumers would do is they would select an item that they want, and the store would kind of set it aside, and they'd come in and they'd make weekly or monthly payments, and that's called layaway. And so that when they had paid for it all, or a majority of it, then they could bring it home. So that's what a lot of Americans did, and so that a large sort of gap between rich and poor, that creates a bit of a problem for the United States. Okay, and it says here, down at the bottom, American investors have begun to pull money out of Germany. Okay, so if we go back to 1925 with the Dawes Plan, the $200 million. In loans. It wasn't the only set of loans, but the reason why Americans start pulling their money out is because they want to invest it in the stock market. Why? Because the stock market in the 1920s is doing really well. Okay, so the 1920s is nicknamed the Roaring '20s in large part because of how good the economy was doing during this time period. Okay, so we need to talk a little bit about the stock market and what caused the stock market to experience such large growth in this period, 1923 to 1929. Okay, so we know that the stock market crash takes place October 1929. Okay, so the time leading up to that, we see these overall stock values are going they're increasing quite rapidly. But why? Why is this happening? Okay, so what you need to understand is the value of a stock price is determined by the profitability of that business. Okay, the more profitable, the more valuable it is seen, and therefore the price of the stock goes up. Generally speaking, I'm speaking in very general terms, so don't get mad at me if I say something that isn't super specifically true. All right. At any rate, so after World War I, with American companies being very profitable because of the demand for American produced goods, American companies were quite profitable. At that time, the stock market was not widely traded. It wasn't exceptionally popular with the American population. And what I mean is, very few people invested their money in the stock market. The media, newspapers, magazines started doing stories on the phenomena of the value of the stock market going up and up. And they started to do stories on the fact that it was a way to kind of get rich quick, okay? And many people who did not or hadn't previously invested in the stock market, not like today. Today, most people, professionals, and even people who have pensions or whatever, their retirements are tied up in the stock prices, or in the stock market, excuse me. Even if they have a pension plan, that pension plan is tied up and invested in the stock market, okay? And so that's pretty much anyone, or most people, if you have any kind of retirement plan. Okay, prior, at this time, that's not the case, all right? So it's a very small percentage of the American population. But because of the increased prices, word gets out, and there's more, attention paid to that by the media. And so more and more people begin investing in the stock market. Some people didn't have the money on hand to make those purchases or to purchase a lot of stocks. So there was a phenomena or a way in which you can do that, and stock markets and banks began lending money to people. And this is very problematic. So a lot of people had bought stocks on the margin. So that means they may put down 10%, and then the stock brokerage house or the bank would front you the 90%. And if something were to happen to the value of the stock, let's say it dropped, the bank or brokerage firm can issue a call on the price, and so you would be expected to fork over the cash to cover that shortage. Needless to say, many people purchased stocks this way, and many people who just didn't have the money, and they also sort of lacked the understanding that over time the stock market goes up and down, up and down, up and down, and because they're only seeing this, they're only seeing it going up and up and up and up. It leads them to be, inexperienced and not understanding what to expect. So they're sort of jittery. And as an investor, you don't want to be jittery. As an investor, you don't even want to pay attention short term to stock prices because you don't want to stress about it because it's a long-term investment. And so when the stock market starts to dip, people begin to panic. So why did the stock market begin to dip in 1929? Because the elevated price of the stock market is what we call a bubble. Okay, instead of the prices going up, the prices weren't going up to reflect the profitability of businesses. Hope that makes sense. I mean, that's normal for prices when they go up. It's because the companies are profitable. That wasn't the case because of decreasing demand for American-made goods. These companies, in fact, were not profitable, and so the value of stocks should have gone down. But it was kept artificially high and inflated because of demand by American investors for those stocks. Okay, so sometime in 1929, the stock market begins to level off, and then in October it begins to dip, and that causes a panic among a lot of those people who had purchased stocks on the margin, and even a lot of firms issue a call for the payment, and it causes people to sell. And it leads to the stock market crash in 1929. Okay. So this has repercussions globally. And we start to see the biggest sign or the biggest effect of the stock market crash and really, the beginning of the Great Depression is seen by really high unemployment, not just in Europe, but also in the United States. Okay, so 25%, 30%, 40%, and even 50 in some instances, not uncommon. All right, so there is tremendous fear, desperation, and governments are not really equipped to deal with this crisis. Going by traditional laissez-faire liberal economic policies, you're supposed to basically wait it out and wait for a market correction that would, take place in short order. So, more or less intuitively, what countries did was they kind of battened down the hatches. And what does that mean? That means they raised tariffs, they cut spending, and just kind of wait the storm out. Okay? Raising tariffs was seen as a way to protect domestic producers from foreign competition. All right, so it's just kind of taking care of your own kind of like economic nationalism, if you will. And so the United States did that with something called the Smoot-Hawley tariff, and some say that these tariffs made the unemployment worse or intensified it because it slowed to a trickle international trade. Okay, so Great Britain succeeds in finding its way out of this economic crisis, the Depression, in just a couple of years by taking that approach, by taking that very liberal, laissez-faire approach of increased tariffs, cutting spending, and just sort of relying on charities and churches to take care of the poor. And they were able to right the ship relatively quickly, which is sort of ironic because a very famous economist was, a Brit who said that, and his name is John Maynard Keynes, that's not at all the way that we're supposed to deal with this. Okay, so he becomes known the father of Keynesian economics. All right, so Keynesian economics versus classic economics, which is laissez-faire, which we already talked about. Government should do very little, and if anything, they should raise tariffs to protect domestic production. He said no. He said what is the problem is a demand issue. Okay, there's not enough demand for consumer items, and that's why there's this vast unemployment. So what we have to do is boost demand. So how do you boost demand? Well, the government does that by deficit spending, usually through public works projects. So the government will fund public works projects, and then this will put unemployed people back to work, and then they'll have money in their hands, in their pockets, and then they will stimulate the economy by, purchasing consumer items. And then hopefully if enough money is injected into the economy, that it will sort of kind of kickstart it again and get it rolling. So that's pretty much the basis of Keynesian economics, and that's what John Maynard Keynes recommended. Great Britain didn't do that, but they were successful. That doesn't mean that Keynesian economics is right or wrong. In some instances, it's right, but it just depends on the country, and economics is definitely not an exact science. The other thing that Keynesian economics calls for is the government to print a lot of money. And some countries did that, but specifically what Keynes was talking about doing was deficit spending. Governments spend, put money in the hands of the taxpayers, the consumers, the citizens. Okay, so in order to kind of manage all of this, you need to grow the size of government, so governmental bureaucracies grow, and then in order to fund all of this, we start to see increased taxes, first for the wealthy, and then over time it trickles down to the middle class. Okay, So make sure you are aware of Keynesian economics. Scandinavian countries utilized Keynesian economics pretty effectively. Okay, so who's Scandinavia? Well, that's going to be Denmark, Sweden, Finland, and Norway. And their approach was to use Keynesian economics to stimulate the economy. But they also had socialistic governments. The Social Democrats were in charge. And so, kind of like under Bismarck in Germany in the late 1800s, these Social Democrats institute a bunch of sort of welfare programs. Okay, so we get old age pensions, we get unemployment insurance, and in some cases, you get even subsidized housing for people who can't afford homes of their own. So that's pretty radical, I guess. I mean, it's novel. And the other thing that's unique about, and it's not in the notes, about these Scandinavian countries is something called cooperatives or cooperative enterprises. And so what you see are a lot of firms, not in industry and also in agriculture, you have cooperatives. So what does that mean? It means that ownership is in the hands of the workers. Okay, so this is a unique feature of socialism. You don't see it; it's not very common. Because typically in socialism the state owns everything. No, with cooperatives, the workers do, and so they make the decisions about what to produce and stuff like that, and they share in the profits. So that model tended to work pretty well, and they say that the Scandinavian countries recovered quickest when it comes to the Great Depression. All right, so let's talk about the United States because it does impact European affairs. So under President Hoover, 1929 to 1932, he does little, not a whole lot of Keynesian economics. They do one massive public works project. They build the Hoover Dam, but that's too limited in scope, I guess, to have any kind of major impact. So he gets booted out of office, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, gets elected in 1932 by promising to do something. And so, within the first 100 days of being sworn in, he institutes the New Deal, which is sweeping legislation designed to attack the Great Depression. All right, and there's a variety of things, some more successful than others. But if we look at this little, graphic over here, they were designed to do three main things: provide relief. Okay, so for those people who were suffering, they would get money in their hands and they would be able to feed their families. Okay, and typically this is not just free money. It came in the shape of jobs. People were not interested in handouts at this time. Socially, it was seen as it was not respectable, and so relief came in the shape of jobs. And then recovery. No, let's get that. Let's go down to reform. Reform was reforming the financial institutions like banks and the stock, the financial industry like the stock market. Make some key, reforms so that this crisis could hopefully be avoided in the future. One example was FDIC. So banks' money can be insured, because one of the big problems was there were these things called runs on the banks. People were afraid that they were going to lose their money and their deposits, so they rushed to the banks to withdraw their money, and that ended up causing a lot of bank failures. So that's one key reform, and no more purchasing stocks on the margin. That becomes banned or outlawed or whatever. Okay, so the other one is recovery, and so this is the big argument. Keynesian economics does not provide the recovery. that we see in Scandinavia, it didn't. It just didn't work. Okay, so in some countries, Keynesian economics works. In some countries, a more traditional liberal or laissez-faire approach works. The United States tried, mostly the Keynesian approach, and it just didn't. It just didn't work out for them. All right. So here is. I'm going to leave you guys with this little political cartoon here, and this is FDR, and this is a critical a political cartoon that is critical of the New Deal because of the waste associated with it. Okay, the reason why I'm showing this is because one of the terms that's used to describe Keynesian economics is called pump priming. Okay, and so here you have this well that any well that before, if it hasn't been pumped for a long time, it gets dry. And so one of the things that you have to do to get it moving again is you have to pour water into the well itself, or into the pump to prime the pump to get it rolling again. Okay, and so what you see is this guy bringing up all this all this water in these buckets to dump into the pump, and what's coming out is just a trickle. So they're pumping all this money into the economy, and only a small amount is coming out. So it just suggests that it's really wasteful. But the key point, economic point that I want to make you understand is pumping or priming the pump. Okay, that's it. Thank you for watching. Have a good night.